I'm here again, yes.
The legendary composer Carter Burwell, who scored this movie among all of our favorites. Carter, can you hear us okay? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Thank you so much for being with us.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Good to be there.
I just wanted to start, I wanted to ask you, you've had such a prolific career and you've worked with some of the best filmmakers working today, but you often will do, 3 to 6 movies a year. Is there kind of a science to picking projects? Is there kind of a science to picking the best scripts for you?
There's truly no science. There's some filmmakers who, of course, will do anything that they want to do, like Martin or the Coen brothers. I'm always, I can't imagine ever saying no, right? But other than that, it's not a science. I will say I'm always looking, if possible, to do something I haven't done before. And that sounds like a simple thing, but I remember going back to the beginning of my career after we did Raising Arizona, Ethan Coen said, you're going to get a lot of calls to do farm comedies now. And it was true. You get typecast in this business very quickly. And I didn't even know there was such a thing as farm comedies. But indeed, people called me up when they wanted banjos and stuff. So I'm always trying to do something I haven't done before, if that's possible.
I've heard you talk a little bit about kind of the duality of some of the scripts and the complexity of some of the scripts the projects that you've worked on, and a certain level of irony and how you can add to maybe one emotional layer that is not necessarily the surface layer, or maybe one kind of theme that's not necessarily the surface theme of the project. And I was wondering, this film specifically uses humor in a really interesting way in what is a very sad story about friendship and about loss. And I was wondering kind of what your direction was there, plugging in, where you feel like you sat on the emotional level of this movie, and where you feel like the music added to different pieces of the themes of this movie.
You're absolutely right. It's a very sad story, but because Martin wrote it, it's of course also, there's humor. I will say the music mostly ignores the humor in this film, and because a lot of it has to do with just a choice of words, things like that, or the pacing. But I think that my feeling about that layer that you're describing and that the music brings to this film is that at the beginning, the music plays as sort of the innocence, the sort of fairy tale world that Colin Farrell's character inhabits with this little miniature donkey, and you kind of get the impression that everything's really the day when the movie begins, and I think the music is trying to do that, sort of plays this sort of a light theme, which because of the harp and celeste, and, the almost childlike elements in the instrumentation, by the end of the story, what began as a very sincere way of playing his situations become a very ironic way, because it's like reminding us, when you hear those same instruments at the end, it reminds you of the beautiful rainbow at the beginning and this beautiful island that they live on, and how, in fact, everything has gone so terribly wrong. So I think that was one of the roles for me of music in this film, was to play that sort of fairy tale thing, but then at the end, the fairy tale is quite, plays as irony, because it's, really not a fairy tale at that point. It also, I'll say, for me, I also thought it would help with the gruesomeness of the dismemberments, because it makes them just a little less real. If you think of the thing as a fairy tale, it's just, I don't think it makes it less horrible, but it's a little more metaphoric than actual, someone actually cutting off their fingers.
Yep. When you start the process with Martin, obviously you've done, I think, all of his films, but when you start this process, is there a direction that he points you in? Is there a kind of thing, or does he just kind of send it to you and say, what do you think? Where should we go with this?
He sent it to me. Usually we don't talk a whole lot about it before he shoots. In this case, we did have a discussion before he shot because he knew that he needed a fiddle tune to be shot on camera. And Benny brought up the fact that, you know, I could write that, but Brendan Gleeson is in fact a fiddler in real life, and Brendan wanted to write it. So it was like, so Martin was like, yeah, how's Carter gonna feel about that? So we discussed this, and Brendan was, you know, well, Carter can write a tune, I'll write a tune, let the best tune win. But I didn't really want to get into a tune writing contest with him, and that's not gonna help on the set either, if you know, if he feels like my tune's been chosen. And anyway, didn't want to go there. So I never did actually write a tune, but that was a discussion that Bart and I had to have before the shoot. And but otherwise, you know, I for instance, I went on reading the script. I said, well, you know, Irish characters on an Irish island during the Irish Civil War. You know, so I can't think of any reason why the music wouldn't be a little bit Irish. And Martin really hated that idea, so we didn't bring that up again. But like, we don't typically settle on very much before the film has been shot. And my general feeling is that there's so many different ways to shoot a screenplay that the screenplay tells you something, but it doesn't really tell me what I need to know to write the music, honestly. So I hardly ever do actually write anything until I've seen the film.
I'm going to ask you one more, and then I'll open it up to the audience. But you've written some of the most iconic themes for these movies. They always seem, in a way, like a great pop song where there is one really theme that sticks with you, and then you play around with it for the rest of the score, and you write around it. It feels like, and I'm curious if some of that is like, you know, in an off time, if you're banking some things, if you're putting kind of lines aside and then going, this might work here, this might work here, or if it's all comes naturally with the new project.
Well, it's a good question. I imagine different composers may have different answers to that question. For myself, if I'm sitting at the piano, which most days I am at some point, and even if I'm not working on a film, and I come up with something that seems at all promising, I do immediately record it on my phone or whatever device I might have with me, or write it down. And I do, in fact, bank these things, that's correct, without knowing what it's for. But, you know, a good tune is hard to find. It's sort of the dark art of being a composer. Like, you can study orchestration, you can study all the harmony, you can study all these other things, but melody, there isn't really a science to it. And so if I have anything that seems like it's promising, I do keep them, and I have more than 1,000 of these things like sort of stocked away. And if I'm at a total loss, sometimes happens, I'll go back and listen to them, or even if I'm just thinking of like different directions I might go, I'll go back and listen to some and say, well, yeah, you could take this, but do it differently. And this is what helps me to sleep at night. having these things on store, so to speak, because otherwise, yeah, if I had to start from the blank page every time, it would be nerve-wracking. It does. I mean, in fact, I often, I do start from the blank page, but but it also helps me to know that I have a jumping-off point.
I'm going to open it up to the audience. Does anybody have any questions? Where you really like to go back and revisit them because you really like the sound of it, and how come for those specific ones, if that's the case?
I have to tell you, I really don't go back. I really don't. At this point, because my sons who are like around 20 years old now, finally, I will go back and show them Fargo or something from 25 years ago or whatever, and because I want them to see what some things that I did that I liked, but I don't personally really enjoy that. You name it, any film that I've worked on, I go back and watch it. All I'm going to be thinking of is, oh, I should have voiced the cellos differently. Oh, I wish I had brought it in like 10 frames before. All I'll do is think about everything I would do differently, and it's so no, there's no situation in which I go back and listen and think, oh, I love that. It really, for me, it's totally the opposite, right? If I listen to any of my old work, I just think, oh my God, I just want to do that differently.
And I'll wrap up with one question on that note is, you mentioned that this score on paper to you might be embarrassingly simple compared to other things. And by all accounts, a lot of people said, and I would agree, that you, in a lot of ways, especially in the early Coen work, changed the way music informed a film and the way it added to a film. But I'm wondering if there are ways you look at your process differently now. Like if in younger days, did you feel like it had to be more elaborate in some way, or it had to be a counterpoint in some way, in ways that you've released yourself of the longer you do this or the older you get, or
To a surprising extent, my attitude and approach hasn't really changed that much. People ask me, because now at this point, the Coens and I have done, 16 films or something, I don't know. And people ask, well, so how's it different? And it's really not different at all. I will say that the very first film I did, and this might be true for the very first film anybody does, that is a special situation because for me, it was blood simple. I didn't know what I was doing, didn't know how film scoring was supposed to work, and with that complete naivete and innocence, and whatever you want to call it, ignorance, you're able to do anything. I was totally unconstrained. I wasn't thinking about dialogue, like trying to work around the dialogue, because I didn't even know how to synchronize the music to the picture. It was a special sort of innocence that you can't recapture. So that one is special. At this point, I know I have all the tools to elaborately synchronize my music to what is happening on the screen, and I do, because that's part of the craft of film scoring. But I didn't have that craft back then. And I'm not despite what I said about Banshees, I'm not a composer of complicated music. I never have been. I'm I'm an untrained composer. I didn't go to music school, and what I write is even my most elaborate scores are very simple. This one was just even simpler than those, and that was striking to me. But again, it seemed right, and it isn't really about that, of course. Who cares if it's complicated or not? I just remember going to those recording sessions and looking at the page, so few notes. But the important thing is whether it works or not.
Well, thank you so much for coming and doing this with us. We really appreciate it. And thank you for all your work.
Well, thank you very much.